Good morning, bienvenue à la conférence de presse au Théâtre national de la presse. Welcome to the press theater. Go ahead.
Welcome to today's press conference. My name is Kurt Goddard, and I'm the Executive Director of Legal and Public Affairs at Inclusion Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We, settlers, are visitors to this land. I am joined by representatives of the Arch Disability Law Centre, Dawn Canada, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and Inclusion Canada. Our organizations are in Ottawa this week in order to monitor Canada's progress in implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Assisted suicide, or medical assistance in dying, in Track 2, is a disability rights issue, both for people with psychosocial disability and for people with other disabilities. I am passionate about this work not only as a lawyer, but also as an individual. I lost my father to a violent suicide in 2010. The traumatic loss continues to affect me and my family. In the year that followed my father's death, I supported my mother, who lived with complex and fluctuating mental illness. Before she passed, I just want to say that I'm very familiar with pleas for assistance to die. There were ups and downs. The complicated mental illness reveals both periods of amazing vibrancy and periods of darkness. Having learned about ableism and MAID from persons with disabilities, including the membership of the organizations gathered here today, and being informed by lived experience, I and my colleagues are supportive of the swift passage of Bill C-62, which delays MAID for mental illness as the sole underlying condition, with an amendment to repeal expansion altogether, and the subsequent tabling of legislation to bring Canada's MAID law back into alignment with disability rights through a full repeal of Track 2. I am happy to introduce Kerri Joffe, staff lawyer with Arch Disability Law Centre, who will speak to MAID for mental illness as a human rights issue.
Thank you, Kurt. Good morning. The organization where I work, Arch Disability Law Centre, is a specialty legal clinic that works exclusively in disability rights law. Arch provides free legal services to low-income people with disabilities across the province of Ontario. We also work with organizations of people with disabilities and disability organizations from across Canada on national issues. As Kurt said, this week myself, my colleagues on the panel, and representatives from disability organizations and communities across the country are meeting with the Canadian Human Rights Commission to discuss some of the key human rights issues facing people with disabilities in our country today. The list is long, but at the very top of that list is medical assistance in dying. Arch is deeply concerned that MAID Track 2 is an answer to suffering caused by economic and social inequality that many people with disabilities live with. At Arch, we have clients who have applied for or are thinking of applying for MAID Track 2 because of suffering related to barriers in society, including living in poverty and a lack of accessible, safe housing. We have clients who cannot get the services they need, for example, attendance services, to help with activities of daily living. Instead of getting services to support them to live with dignity in the community, they are given the impossible and false choice of living in the community in unsafe conditions or moving into a hospital or long-term care institution, where they will get services, but will have to give up their dignity, independence, work, and relationships. These are not people who are dying or people who want to die. They are simply disabled enough to need a level of support in the community that Ontario does not offer. Arch has clients who cannot get mental health services or who've been on wait lists for mental health care for long periods of time. And this is consistent with 2022 Stats Canada data, indicating that there are often long wait times for community mental health counseling, and that 1 out of 3 people with a mood, anxiety, or substance use disorder report unmet or only partially met needs for mental health care services. Arch is deeply concerned that expanding MAID to people whose sole condition is a mental disorder will lead to even more people contemplating, applying for, and receiving MAID due to socioeconomic suffering. And our concerns are bolstered by the concerns we've heard from psychiatrists. In a recent national survey, 61% of psychiatrists said that MAID for mental disorders should not be allowed, and 80% said that the Canadian medical system is not prepared for MAID for mental disorders. Psychiatrists said that Canada's healthcare system barely has enough resources to provide basic mental health care. And the pressures for expediency, budget cuts, and beds will lead psychiatrists to suggest MAID and patients to choose MAID as a quick and easy solution. Arch has also said that MAID Track 2 violates Canada's international human rights obligations, including rights for people with disabilities, which Canada agreed to implement when it ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And one of those rights in the convention is the right to life. Free choice is a central pillar of the right to life as it applies to assisted dying. The right to life requires that a person freely choose assisted death without any coercion or external pressure. People with disabilities who live with persistent poverty, lack of safe, accessible housing, social isolation, lack of adequate services and supports in the community, and people whose only option is to live in an institution all face social and economic pressure. Their choices are extremely limited, and often they are not in a position to exercise free, unconstrained choice when it comes to decisions about MAID. This has been recognized over and over again by a number of UN disability rights experts, one of whom said that economic and social rights are key to affording genuine autonomy instead of the myth that is currently in the law at the moment. Some argue that people with mental health disabilities deserve equal access to MAID, and that if people want MAID, we should give it to them. Who are we to judge? But we should all remember that expanding MAID to mental disorders is a judgment. It is an active step that says that we as Canadians feel it is a safe and necessary service to provide through our publicly funded healthcare system. The serious concerns expressed by disability communities and the healthcare community demonstrate that MAID for mental disorders is not safe. And we should also remember that MAID is an exemption to the crime of assisting someone to commit suicide. Why is that a crime? Because we value life, and because suicide prevention is an important public health objective. Everyone is entitled to equal access to suicide prevention, health care, an adequate standard of living, accessible, safe housing, and supports to live with dignity in the community. Without economic and social rights enshrined in law and implemented in reality, MAID Track 2 and MAID for mental disorders is dangerous and is a violation of the rights of disabled people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerri. It's crucial that we adhere to the CRPD's call to follow the social model of disability, recognizing the disabling nature of attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder a person's full participation in society on an equal basis with others. Our next presenter is Bonnie Brayton, CEO of Dawn Canada, who will speak to Dawn's intersectional feminist approach, which leads her to call for the Sunset Clause to be repealed.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you for your attention this morning. Dawn Canada is the only national organization in Canada representing women, girls, and gender diverse people with disabilities since 1985. Our mission remains to end the poverty, isolation, discrimination, and violence experienced by women, girls, and gender diverse people living with disabilities. From our inception until now, far too much of our time, energy, and resources have been focused almost exclusively on these concerns. We're coming up on 40 years in service, and I know it would devastate our founders to know that I am standing here because we are in the fight of our lives, for our lives, and those of our sisters. But here we are. 30% of all women in Canada live with a disability, according to Statistics Canada. So fully 1/3 of all women in this country. We continue to face the highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of violence, and the highest rates of gender-based violence writ large. And limited as the data collection has been, we know that women with disabilities are already accessing Track 2 MAID at higher rates than men. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with both mental illness and disability, and I would say that the evidence is fairly clear why that's the case. In a 1995 Dawn Canada publication called Don't Tell Us to Take a Hot Bath, Shirley Masuda recognized both these intersections and the inherent risks it meant to women with disabilities in terms of the devaluation of our lives and the likelihood that we would indeed one day be facing a battle for our lives against state-sponsored violence, and here we are. When Tracy Latimer's life was taken, we warned of the slippery slope where the memory of her life remains to this day. In her brilliant and incredibly detailed parliamentary brief, our then President Carmela Hutchison wrote from her bed in a hospital following an induced coma, also sharing the chilling experience she and other patients and family members on the critical care unit where Carmela was, were both subtly and not subtly being encouraged to consider MAID. And this is at onset of MAID before Track 2. On that ward. Carmela also reminds us that in that brief of Misty Franklin, a woman with a disability whose entire life trajectory was from childhood about coercion, control, and violence, about how easily and how many women and girls in this country become victims of violence and abuse, become disabled through that violence, and are forgotten. I have the names, post-it notes, beside my desk of women who reached out to Dawn Canada because they wanted to be hopeful, wanted to live, but were already so desperate that MAID was presenting to them with what seemed to be their only option. On those post-it notes are the names of Susan and Ruth. They're both gone, they both lost hope, and they are dead. More could be said, but I'll shift our focus for a moment to Ashley Smith, a child with a disability, a child who was lost to a system that sent her to an adult incarceration and death because she threw an apple, all while her protectors looked on. Although men are more likely to die by suicide, women are 3 times more likely to attempt to end their lives. And women are hospitalized 1.5 times more often than men for suicide-related behaviors. Again, supported data. This trend is reflected in other countries, in Belgium and the Netherlands. Psychiatric MAID has been overwhelmingly accessed by women. Between 69 and 77% of psychiatric MAID deaths in those countries are women. And so to quote Carmela Hutchison, the grim reminder in that brief, we do not have capital punishment in this country, nor do we extradite offenders to countries who do, because we are concerned that we may inadvertently execute an innocent person and cannot devise adequate safeguards to prevent this. And so it is for this reason, at the press conference today, it makes it clear that the legislation we have to put the brakes on Track 2 MAID and must pass the legislation we're discussing today and completely repeal Track 2, and nothing less is our objective from Dawn Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. All Canadians deserve equitable access to suicide prevention, and women with disabilities are not disposable. Next, I'd like to introduce Heather Walkus, chairperson of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. Heather will speak to the harms caused by Canada's current MAID law, which led her to call for the repeal of Track 2. Heather.
Hello. I'm glad to be here because for so many years, in the 48 years that Council of Canadians has been in existence, we have every year had to face the attitude of people that we are disposable. There's nothing wrong with people with disabilities. It's an inaccessible environment, policies and attitudes that disable us. My body is as able as anybody's body can be. However, because of that, there's a long history of how people with disabilities are viewed and how they're treated. In Canada, there was a time when most people lived in rural environments. But when Canada the population shifted from 75% rural to 75% in cities, we became noticed. We weren't hidden anymore. And as a result, the inequities of housing, of just trying to get through a city, find housing for many of us, didn't happen. And we're still, all these years later, 45 years later, since that huge shift of the population in Canada, we're still considered less than. It's a frustrating time for us right now because now we have an absolute legal fight to push back on Track 2. Track 2 says anyone can choose MAID. There's no way of knowing how many people, if they had the resources, they had the support, if they weren't in poverty or did not have a place to live, would still be alive today as a result of proper supports. Our people, disabled country, in this country of Canada, are choosing MAID not because they're suffering because of their disability. They've chosen MAID because of the suffering caused by a society that does not care. And this is something I think we really need to look at, because already in my life, and I'm almost 69, I've had 5 different medical and social worker people suggest MAID to me as an option of being blind and also in a chair. I am the head of the largest, oldest, and organization of people with disabilities who work together to try to make change in this country, along with the organizations of my colleagues. It is a long, hard fight, and the idea that we are using rights in this country, the right to die, instead of the right to live, astounds me. I'm a history buff, and one of the things that I've really noted in the early 1900s in Europe was how many people were with disabilities, especially after the war, the First World War, were institutionalized, pushed away, locked away, many with experiments, many with starving. That was a sequel, or the sequence of events into the war, Second World War. It wasn't a big leap that people with disabilities were the first groups annihilated. Genocide is genocide. It may look pretty because we have laws, but it's really comes down to dollars and cents. We saw it during COVID. We saw a really important thing happen in this country. Premiers and our Prime Minister stood up every day to tell us what's going on with COVID, and they talked about we're there for contributing Canadians. Yet the disability community lost supports. Can you imagine if you're in a bed and your health support worker that's to help you get out of bed no longer came, and there was no way for you to get out of bed? many of our people were left for days and days and days without food, without water, without the supports that were in place. As we went through COVID, we noticed something very interesting, that the supports that we used were thin, very thin. We rely on public transportation, wasn't there. The ability to continue getting support through the medical profession was very thin. Many of our people ended up in hospital without supports like an intervener, without supports like a sign language, without supports to be able to say what you wanted. In the hospital near where I lived, there was a clear directive that you cannot do, if someone was in heart failure, they could not resuscitate them because of the fear of their breath hitting the medical staff. Many of our people were in hospital or in congregate care facilities, had no one to advocate for them, and most of those people had one or another form of disability. When we look at StatsCan and we look at the latest numbers, it is clear that we are edging into 1/3 of the population of Canada is reporting to have a disability. 1/3 of us are disposable. And it is cheaper to kill us than it is to support us to live. It comes down to that basic number game. And it comes down to a belief and a backwards argument around the right to die. I want to finish with something. We deserve the right to live. How about that being the standard, that we all deserve the right to live with dignity, support, and in a way that we are not pressured and pushed, and our world becomes so small because slowly our supports disappeared during COVID and they've not come back, and in fact they're much less than they were. This is the pain that is in the disability community and their families. How do we deal with this? In a country this large and this has so much resources, we don't even have a national program to get wheelchairs, to get hearing aids, to do things that support that we could have more independence. Again, it's cheaper to let us die. And during COVID, while people talked about contributing Canadians and ensured they had a level of income, people with disabilities stayed well below the 38 poverty levels that are used in this country. The result of that was that many of us perished during COVID, not because of COVID, but because we were never in the disaster plan and we were forgotten. And that's painful for me. And yet no one has done the study about what happened in COVID. What really happened to us? And we're coming out of it. During COVID, Track 2 came into place, that anybody with a disability is able to die. So you reduce resources, you reduce support, you push people to the margins, you drive them to the margins, and then say, well, it's their disability that caused them suffering, so they chose MAID. And that is where we plead to all Canadians, take a look at that. We are not sort of an obscure group of aliens. We are your brothers, your sisters, your mothers, your dads, your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews. That's who we are. And yet, rather than the support to live, we have a support to die. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Heather. While it is imperative that MAID for mental illness not become legal this March, or ever, there are significant issues with Canada's existing MAID law which need to be addressed as soon as Bill C-62 is passed with an amendment, the amendment that we're calling for, to repeal the expansion indefinitely. Our final speaker of the day is Krista Carr, Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada. Krista will speak to the question of readiness and how the government can respond to the systemic harms being caused to persons with disabilities.
Thanks, Kurt. Inclusion Canada is a national organization advancing the human rights and full inclusion of people with an intellectual disability and their families. We've been raising concerns with Canada's MAID regime since the Supreme Court decision on Carter. We intervened in the Carter case, asking for the Supreme Court not to open the door to medical assistance in dying, because we knew full well that once that door was opened, it would become a slippery slope to death for persons with a disability. However, even we could never have conceived of just exactly how slippery that slope would be and the breakneck speed at which expansion would happen. We were also an intervener in the Truchon-Gladue case that went unappealed by the federal government in 2019. This decision led to the government expanding assisted suicide to people with a disability whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. It is practically unprecedented that the federal government would amend the criminal code based on one low court decision in one province in Canada. You would normally see them defend their legislation all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and only change it if mandated at that level. In this case, however, the government chose not to appeal the Truchon decision and has professed that expanding MAID to people not at the end of life was mandated by the courts, when that simply is not the case. Fundamentally, we know that MAID to persons with disabilities not at end of life, as opposed to suicide prevention and other social and economic supports, is unequivocally discriminatory. Disability organizations across this country have been clear about this and predicted that if we expanded MAID to people with a disability not at the end of life, people would die who desperately wanted merely to be able to live a life of dignity with the support needed to do so. And right we were. If you look at the data on MAID deaths in Canada, we have already outpaced countries who have had some form of legalized medical assistance in dying for years longer than we have. We are seen as having the most permissive MAID regime in the world. 682 people with disabilities, not at end of life, died under Track 2 MAID in 2021 and 2022. We don't even have the numbers yet for 2023. So when they tell you that expanding MAID further to include people with a mental illness will only be a very, very small number of people, remember, that's what they said when they implemented Track 2. And it's expanding. The numbers are getting higher every year. We were shocked when the decision to legalize MAID for mental illness was made over a matter of days back in 2021, when the Senate suggested a sunset clause be added to Bill C-7. This happened at the 11th hour, following all consultation and committee study that never even debated assisted suicide for people with mental illness because the bill expressly excluded them from it. Passing the sunset clause was a rushed and uninformed decision. In debating whether to make medical assisted suicide more widely available, the government has only celebrated their progress in moving towards readiness for MAID for mental illness. We are not ready, and we will never be ready, because we simply must not go down this road. Why? Because over 3 million Canadians have a mental health related disability. Because mental illness is the fastest growing disability type in Canada. Because half of all Canadians have unmet mental health care needs. Nationally, the average wait time for psychiatric care is up to 2 years. People with an intellectual disability experience unique barriers. 1 in 3 people with an intellectual disability are overprescribed antipsychotic medication. Diagnostic overshadowing gets in the way of actual mental health diagnosis. Much mental health treatment continues to occur within institutions known to put people with intellectual disabilities at risk of serious harm. and few therapists have enough training to feel confident in even treating people with an intellectual disability. People with disabilities are dying by MAID in coercive, inhumane circumstances. They're choosing death by MAID over life in poverty, institutionalization in long-term care, without adequate housing or pain relief, lack of access to home care and other disability support services. They're dying because Canada is failing to meet their needs and facilitate a life of dignity. They are not dying to escape a painful life that is not caused. They are dying to escape a painful life not caused by their disability, but by gaping holes in our social safety net. Our government is failing to recognize the deep-seated ableism and discrimination that makes all of this possible. No, we are not ready to further expand an already discriminatory system that never should have been put in place in the first place. We never have been, and we never will be.
Thank you, Krista. And thank you to all of our speakers. And with that, I will turn things over for the Q&A portion of our event.
Thank you. We'll now start the question period. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. We'll start in the room with Megan. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. My name's Megan Gilmore. I'm with Canadian Affairs. This question is for probably for Kurt or Kerri. I just wanted to have somebody speak to the legal issues around this, because we have heard people say, like, the courts said that we need to have MAID for mental illness. I was just wondering if either of you could explain why that's an incorrect interpretation of the law.
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Thanks for the question. We've never had a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada that has said that MAID needs to be expanded to people with mental illnesses or mental health disabilities. In Carter, the Supreme Court said that their decision was limited to the facts of that particular case, and they were not pronouncing on any other circumstances, which may be brought forward to the courts. And that case was not a situation of people who had mental illnesses or were asking for MAID in relation to a mental illness. So we've never had a decision from the highest court in the land about this. And as Krista mentioned, our government chose not to appeal the decision in Truchon, the Quebec lower court decision, up to the Supreme Court of Canada. That case was also not about mental illnesses, so we've never had a pronouncement from the Supreme Court on this. Did you want to add anything, Kurt?
That's great.
Do you have a follow-up?
No, not right now. Thank you.
Perfect. There's no more questions, so this will conclude the press conference. Ceci me fait la conférence. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you.